Applied Kinesiology, Session 6 of the basic course. This is going to be the video version. This is my contact information. Office phone, cell phone is the best way to get a hold of me, or email, or text. Facebook, we have a Facebook page for our clinic. We do not, unfortunately, have a website. We're going to start with going over Session 5 material briefly. In Session 5, way back in February of 2020, we introduced the applied kinesiology approach to meridian therapy, where we use muscle testing, therapy localization on the pulse points, and then we reference related muscles to a particular meridian that shows deficiency, and then we correct by stimulating the tonification point and making corrections at the spinal bladder meridian points that relate to that particular meridian. We also went over rocker motion and Prite, pitch, roll, yaw, and tilt, and this was another technique that developed by Dr. Goodhart that helps us determine if the different body modules are functioning optimally with relationship to each other, mainly around the occiput, upper cervical area, the pelvis, lumbosacral area, and then of course the thoracolumbar area. We also had a formal introduction to injury recall technique, which I had introduced earlier in the course, but we took a much more closer look and workshopped it. And that, of course, is the system developed by Dr. Wally Schmidt, where we look for old injuries that are still causing disruption in the afferent, efferent conversation between the muscle and the central nervous system. We introduced the TS line, the temporosphenoidal line, also known as the time saver line. And this was a collection of reflex points along the temporosphenoidal sutural line on the cranium, basically outlining where the temporalis muscle attaches at the edge of the temporal fossa. Each one of these reflex points relates to a certain muscle, a certain organ. We introduced a couple more cranial faults, i.e. the glabellar fault, which relates to blood pressure, and TMJ, which we're going to be going into in Session 6. And we talked about sutural faults, which can be found anywhere in the skull. Anywhere there's a suture, there can be a potential, usually from trauma or chronic stress on the area. We talked about thyroid and the AK approach to thyroid, testing the teres minor muscle as what appears to be the most sensitive muscle to the triple warmer meridian and thyroid function. And we talked about ways of using AK to evaluate the need for nutritional therapy. You can also test for homeopathy. And then what we spent a lot of time on in Session 5 was the shoulder muscles and various shoulder conditions. Shoulder tendinitis, rotator cuff issues, how muscle imbalances can create a lot of these name brand conditions like shoulder bursitis and tendinitis and rotator cuff damage, things like that. And so I have some slides here that briefly go over all of the muscles, and then I have a demo video that I'll put on right after this, where we go through all the muscles from session 1 on. So as you can see, session 1 and 2 muscles, just to kind of refresh your memory, going back, upper trap, SCM, rhomboid, etc. We've covered a lot of muscles up to now. Session 3 muscles, there's some overlap there, upper trap again, middle and lower trap, serratus, neck, popliteus, which I think is an unsung hero of knee evaluation. It's a great muscle to test when you have any kind of a knee problem. All of the muscles across the knee are great muscles to test, of course, but popliteus often is overlooked, and it's a difficult muscle to test properly. So, but when you find it, you can, and you correct its function, you can make some some real headway with knee problems. We talked about the pectoralis minor in the bottom there, and its relationship to lymphatic flow, and we in prior sessions, we had learned about lymphatic, or what was called retrograde, where we can help normalize lymphatic flow. The pectoralis minor plays a big role in that final area where the lymph goes back into general circulation. Pec minor also is an important shoulder muscle, and often I find it involved with other kinds of brachial plexus problems, as well as elbow and wrist problems, which we'll be going into in session 6. Session 4 muscles, we got into down in the lower half of this slide, we got into the ankle foot muscles. Actually, the whole, from tib anterior down is all ankle foot muscles, and we did a lot of work with the feet. Session 5 again, of course, the sits muscles, rotator cuff muscles, coracobrachialis, subclavius, rhomboid, levator scapula. And I'll have, like I say, I'm going to go through all of those. Here, the new muscles we'll be learning in session 6, elbow muscles and forearm wrist muscles. And then along with that, we're going to learn about how to make corrections in these muscles. And often we can correct a lot of the, like, elbow extensor tendonitis kinds of problems, as well as wrist dysfunction. So the session 6 preview, we're going to be taking meridian therapy to the next step, and we're going to learn how to use the 24-hour clock. And in addition to learning the tonification points and sedation points that we learned last time, we're going to be learning low points or connector points, so we can move energy from one meridian to the next depending on where the deficiency is. We're going to get into elbow, forearm, wrist muscles and elbow, forearm, wrist conditions. Carpal tunnel syndrome, supinator syndrome. We're going to talk about hyoid muscles, TMJ, which is a big favorite of mine, neurological tooth. So we're going to get into some more cranial faults and how to fix them. Diaphragm, very important. And then along with that, we're going to learn about how to evaluate a hiatal hernia or pseudo-hiatal hernia, which a lot of people will like to call a lot of the conditions that aren't really true hiatal hernias. Spinalogenic reflex, it's another spinal technique for when you do a subluxation correction or a fixation correction, but then the pain pattern doesn't seem to want to go away. This is sometimes the key to taking it that next step when you're doing spinal corrections. Iliolumbar ligament goes along with gait, specifically backwards gait. And we're going to formally introduce cranial stress receptors. We've talked about those down through the course. Every time we have a muscle slide, there'll be, of course, the Chapman reflex, the the Bennett reflex, the related meridian nutrition, and then there'll be the stress receptors, but we haven't really talked about those too much. So the next we're going to go into a review of the meridian therapy that we introduced in session 5, and then we're going to move on into the 24-hour clock procedure. The acupuncture meridians, the fifth was considered the fifth of the 5 factors. It's not necessarily in that order, but we have the 5 factors of the IVF, as Dr. Goodhart termed it years ago. And we organize the different types of phenomenon that can impact whether a muscle is able to facilitate or not, based on these 5 categories of factors that can affect it. And of course, one is the meridian, and of course the spinal nerve and its relationship to the spine, as well as the afferent nerve flow coming from the periphery, the extremity joints. Craniosacral mechanism involving all the various cranial faults, as well as all the various sacral faults, which influence and control the craniosacral, or the cerebral spinal fluid flow through the spine and around the brain. Lymphatic drainage we access through the Bennett or the Chapman reflexes or neurolymphatic reflexes, and the arterial circulation, which we access through the Bennett points or the neurovascular reflexes. And then, of course, the meridian system, which we access initially through the pulse points on the wrist, which is, those of you who are acupuncturists are very familiar with these. Now, Dr. Goodhart did add the 4th pulse point that relates to the governing vessel and the conception vessel. And if that gets too confusing, then just stay with the 3 traditional ones. And if those don't show, and you've cleared all the other factors that might affect whether you're getting a good reading or not, then it's a good time to check those. Or you can check them right off the bat. Often I'll find if a person is really locked up and I can't find a positive pulse point, I'll check the governing vessel, conception vessel point. And then often I will go right to the diaphragm, because the diaphragm can be influencing how the chi is flowing. But this is, of course, how we, if you remember in session 5, we had the patient therapy localize the pulse points, and then we would test a strong indicator muscle. These are the organs, of course. The yin organs are the solid organs that work steadily all the time. The yang meridians are the hollow organs, which will work very intensely and then kind of chill. Like, for example, the stomach kind of rests until we eat, and then it fills up and starts peristalting and producing enzymes. It's it has a very intense activity for a while, and then eventually it rests again. This is kind of a quick view chart of the main muscles that are related to each meridian. We've gone over those. These are the tonification and sedation points. We didn't really talk much about sedation points, but these are points that will actually turn, they'll turn energy down temporarily in the meridian. And a strong indicator muscle or a muscle that's testing strong, that if you go to the meridian that muscle is related to and tap the sedation point, typically you will get a temporary weakening of that muscle. And that's actually one way to tell if you've got a hypertonic muscle or not. If a muscle appears to be hypertonic, meaning it's just not, it's like its threshold is set too high, you can tap the sedation point, and if that muscle doesn't turn off temporarily, then that's a good indication that you've got a hypertonic muscle. So then, of course, you would go back to session 1 material and look at the antagonist to that muscle. If the hamstrings aren't turning off to their own sedation point, or the psoas isn't turning off to its sedation point, then you want to go to the glute max, perhaps piriformis antagonist to the psoas, and check for weakening. So remember, the tonification and sedation points are located between the knee and the toes, and between the elbow and the fingertips. The alarm points are diagnostic points, the way we use them, and these are points that will let you know if you have an active problem with the meridian. For example, we go through the test, if we go through the pulse point test and get a weakening of a strong indicator muscle, we then go to a muscle related to that meridian and look for weakening, and then we will have the patient TL the alarm point, and if the muscle turns back on, or the muscle turns back on, then we know we have a problem, we have a deficiency at that meridian. Here's another picture of the alarm points that has the actual names of the alarm points. 6 of them, of course, are midline on the conception vessel, and really only liver and gallbladder have their alarm point on their own meridian. The rest, in lung as well. So here's the associated points. These are the points along the bladder meridian that relate to each of the other meridians, including the bladder. So each meridian has like an intersection point, if you will, on the bladder meridian, which is often where we'll find a fixation or subluxation in the course of our exploration. Another picture of the associated points that I threw in that you can use. The 85% protocol, if you remember, the 85% protocol, we start with a strong indicator muscle. We have the patient therapy localize the pulse points. One of the 6 locations on either wrist ideally should show positive. Then we would go to a related muscle. Say, for example, the left middle pulse point tested positive. That's either liver or gallbladder, i.e. Wood element. We can test superficial and deep, but test superficial and deep, and you may get a good clear distinction. You may have to test muscles related to both meridians. Say for example, the middle pulse point tested positive on the left. We would test a pectoralis major sternal, which is related to the liver, or a rhomboid. If it was the superficial, it would be the gallbladder, so we would test popliteus muscle. If, say, for example, the PMS S muscle is weak in the clear, then we would go to the alarm point for the liver meridian. If that muscle tests strong, then we would go back and we would test for related nutrition to the liver. Then we would go to the associated. We would go to the associated points along the spine and have the patient TL, or we could challenge. We TL and then challenge to find out what kind of subluxation or fixation we have. And then after we find that, we adjust, and then we stimulate the tonification point. And then we go back, and that meridian shouldn't show on the pulse point at that point. Now next we're going to move into the 24-hour clock. So the